good to be here again for this second session in this series that I entitled Stranger, Neighbor, Citizen, Polish Jewry in History and Historiography. We're going to be moving up a few centuries from our first lecture when we talked about beginnings. Instead, we'll be moving into the late 18th, early 19th century, when Poland, in a sense, loses its independence. As in the previous lecture, we'll be using a combination of images, artistic, literary, and otherwise, and a kind of mix between images and what we would call regular historical facts, because many times the images are what endure rather than the plain historical facts. I called this talk Messianists, Pragmatists, and Patriots, Jews in the Polish National Struggle. And to open tonight, I want to show you a selection from a film, a 1992 Polish film entitled Szwadron, or Squadron. The date 1992 is important because a movie like this could never have been made in Poland during the communist period, since it has such a strong anti-Russian theme. The subject of the movie is a Russian cavalry squadron sent to Poland to put down the Polish revolt of 1863. And it is seen through the eyes of a young, idealistic Russian nobleman officer attached to this cavalry squadron, and what he sees from one moment to the next. What we will see for a few moments is one of the opening scenes of this movie, where a young Jew is caught under suspicion of sending information about the location of Russian troops to the Polish revolutionaries. And we'll see what happens. It's not easy to watch, but it's important to see for our theme of our program tonight.
Это не свое! Это травение Немчука! Немчук, молодец! На тебе за твой подвиг.
Благодарствую, ваше благородие. Выпью за вас. Они мне не нужны, ваше благородие.
Бери и береги, как зеница ока.
Ну, довольно баловаться с жидовской мордой.
Павель! Капитан! Авергарду!
Два вот, ваше благородие, которые?
Этот. Ну так, nazwisko.
Ja się nazywam... Ja co nie mają pieniądze?
Jewryjska jewoła. Człowieku, toż ty stoisz przed sądem. Jeżeli nie będziesz nam tu odpowiadał, jak się należy, to my mamy takie specjały, że twoja dupa będzie przez rok sina.
Ja jestem Lejwa. Ciebie.
Tyś wysłał tego Icka z butami do ekonoma?
Pan ekonom jest gdzieś na jakimś Śląsku. On potrzebował uciekać, bo pan Markowski chciał jemu troszeczkę powiesić. Bez to, co on pobił jednemu chłopu może raz, może dwa razy.
Ty jesteś mądry Żyd. I ty dobrze wiesz, o co ja ciebie pytam. I ty nam zaraz powiesz, kto kazał trzymać osiodłane konie i zawiadamiać powstańców o ruchach naszych wojsk.
Konie, to najpierw komitetniki, a potem te żandary narodowe. I co one by tylko kazały? Bo od tego one są żandary, ale one strasznie były.
Ты же знал, что наши войска приближаются, когда послал Симку с бутами.
No, ja wiem, jak potrzebowała mi pilna robota, to nawet nie wychodziłem z stołówki.
А Симка не выходил?
To znaczy nie wychodziłem. Ja jemu sam posyłałem na to powody, a to powłosek. Ale on jest taki głupi, że jak go posłać, to z przeproszeniem jak po śmierci.
No to wychodzi na to, że tym razem rzeczywiście posłałeś go po śmierć.
Po co powiedzieć takie brzydkie słowo?
Kazak, отведи-ка в сторону, еврея. Teraz ty. Ze wszystkiego wynika, że byłeś na usługach powstańczej organizacji i próbowałeś ostrzec ich władzę o ruchach naszych wojsk. Za to jest tylko jedna kara. Powieszenie.
A nie na razie żartuję. Za co mnie powieszą?
Za szyję.
No jak to tak? To niemozemne.
Zaraz się przekonam. Winowat w szpionaży или нет? Февель Худоус.
Да, ваше благородие, все евреи шпионы и изменники. Надо их придушить и...
C'est juste, parfaitement juste. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec des espions? On les pend.
Поручик Журин.
Дело не совсем простое. Этот город терроризировали повстанцы. Файндов мог действовать и доносить из чувства страха перед ним. Если он действительно служит польским бунтовщикам, нужно его передать следственной комиссии в роддоме.
Я согласен с поручиком Журиным.
Граф, у вас нет права голоса. Пишите. Приговор принят 3 голосами против 1. Емельянов, подожди. Jakie jest twoje ostatnie słowo?
Tak. Ja chcę powiedzieć moje ostatnie słowo. Ale to nie będzie tylko moje słowo. To będzie słowo wszystkich ludzi, którzy chcą, żeby Rosjanie nie uciskały Polaków. Żeby każdy mógł wyznawać swoją religię. Żeby nikogo za jego myśl nie można było wysłać na Sybir, ani wieszać, ani prześladować. Tysiące naszych już zginęły. Ale my i tak zwyciężymy.
Tak wszystko. Przemowa zakończona. Poszli.
Капитан, это незаконно.
Поручик Журин.
Капитан Добровольский, остановите казнь. Поймите, у него могут быть очень важные сведения, которые сохранят сотню жизней. Мертвый он нам не нужен. Мы не имеем права сейчас вешать этого еврея. Он сам признался, что принадлежит повстанческой организации, и его должна допросить следственная комиссия в роддоме.
Поручик Журин, здесь я решаю. Все.
Немчук, Емельянов! Патруль!
Mon capitaine?
Первый отряд, встать!
What we saw here in this difficult scene is a Hasidic boy working for the rebels and who pays for this with his life. And he speaks as a Polish patriot. And this image of the Jew, particularly the Orthodox Jew, as being a Polish patriot, is something that enters into Polish literature, Polish folklore, Polish myths. And we'll have to see in today's talk exactly how this develops and to how much it really corresponds to reality, if at all. The very idea of a Jewish rebel rebelling against the government is something which is unusual in the first place. The religious and cultural background of Jews talks about loyalty to the state, going back to the prophet Jeremiah, telling the exiles in Babylonia to seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you and prayed to the Lord in its behalf. And in Pirkei Avot, the well-known saying that we should pray for the welfare of the ruling power, even if it's the Roman government, since but for the fear thereof, men would engulf one another. And besides any saying from the Bible or Talmud we might pick up and quote, there is the historical experience of Jews, where the safety of Jews was usually dependent on rulers, on loyalty to rulers. Just as we saw last time, the charters that were granted to Jews by the kings, by the rulers, and they guaranteed those rights as well. But then there's a second issue here. Besides the very notion of Jews being rebels, there's the question of Jews and army service. And this is an issue that arises in every modern European state once they begin to develop modern mass armies rather than smaller professional armies. The issue arises whether to include Jews in army service or not to include them in this move to a modern army and a modern state. Why would it be problematic? There was a fear of the Jew as alien. Remember, we talked about our three things of stranger, neighbor, citizen. And the Jew, no matter how many centuries he might have lived in France or Germany or England, he was still regarded as alien in a certain respect. And besides the fact there were certain characteristics of Jews that were regarded as not exactly appropriate for military service, such as Jews being cowards, and Jews being unable to be part of the esprit de corps or Kameradschaft because they don't really feel at one with the majority of the citizens. And finally, there was the notion that the Jew was not trustworthy or loyal. On the part of the Jews and Jewish leaders, army service was also feared and not welcomed by many of them because it was regarded as an assimilatory experience, forcing Jews to violate the Sabbath, kashrut, and other Jewish laws because of their army service, and hence the fears of rabbis about Jews going into armies. But on the other hand, there is the kind of logic of the modern state that wants to take in every part of the population, regarding every part of the population as a kind of asset. And so, just to be consistent, we can't keep Jews, or peasants for that matter, out of the general status of citizenship. So, when we see Jews fighting for Poland, this is also something which is not taken for granted, and many issues arise, religious and otherwise, as we shall see as we go on. We talked about Poland last time. It was called the Paradisus Judaeorum, the Jewish paradise in the eyes of Jews and Gentiles alike, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious Polish-Lithuanian commonwealth. And Jews indeed felt at home in Poland. My friend and colleague, Professor Gershon coined the phrase talking about Jews and other Poles, when he actually claimed that Jews may have been the first people in Poland to regard themselves as Poles rather than any other identity. Right now, in the chronology of what we're talking about tonight, we're talking about Poland in the era when Polish independence ended, in the period of the so-called partitions, when in 3 steps, Poland's neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, would carve out one piece after another of Polish territory until the Polish state disappears altogether. And part of the struggle to maintain and then to regain Polish independence was the tradition, the military tradition, that the way to regain Polish independence was through military means. And again, the question is asked, are Jews part of this insurrectionary tradition? We will see later on the example of Berek Yoselevich, who organized a unit of volunteers who fought in the Kościuszko uprising of 1794, and we will see further examples of Jews in the 19th century when there would be further Polish revolts. We talked about the partitions of Poland. Here you can see in the different colors the three stages. The purple is the first partition, the green is the second, and the yellow is the third partition, after which the Polish state disappears. And this is probably the most salient political fact about Poland in this period, that from 1795 until 1918, there would be no independent Polish state. And Poles, split between three different empires, struggled each in their own way to try to find a way to preserve their identity, to maintain their identity, and to hope for the restoration of their independence. One of the last major attempts to preserve Polish independence was a series of reforms that were enacted or discussed at least between 1788 and 1792. And the crowning achievement of this was the 3rd May Constitution of 1791. And here we go again to art, again to Jan Matejko, the noted Polish national painter. And we see the scene, and we could identify all the different characters involved in the writing and ratification of the Polish Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791. But I call your attention to the bottom right corner of the picture here, where we see two faces sort of sticking their face into the picture, really at the margin of the picture. And here we can see this in more detail. Here it's right next to Matejko's own signature. And here is the year 1891, in other words, 100 years since the time the Constitution was adopted. And who do we see here at the edge of the picture, literally at the edge of the picture, almost not in the picture? Two Jews, an older Jew and a younger Jew. I won't go into the discussions in art historians and Polish historians trying to decipher what exactly is the meaning of the look on the face of the two Jews, and particularly the finger gesture that the old Jew is making. I won't get into that. It's not worth the time right now. The usual explanation is that the older Jew is looking on the proceedings somewhat hesitantly, whereas the younger Jew is looking at the proceedings in a more hopeful manner. What's important, though, is when I said Jews on the margin, in one major sense, Matejko is correct in placing Jews on the margin. The Jewish issue was discussed during that 4-year period between 1788 and 1792, but in the end, Jews were not included in the freedoms and rights of the Polish Constitution. This was, as we know from other places and other parliaments, it was pushed off to a committee and never really carried out. So the Jews, in a sense, were on the margin in this major last attempt to preserve Polish independence. Although Jews did take part in a very active pamphlet literature surrounding all the questions, the constitutional questions about Poland, including the Jews, and Jews of all kinds, including rabbis, wrote pamphlets in Polish trying to defend Jewish rights and demanding that Jews be given rights along with everyone else. We said that after 1795 there is no Polish state, and the Polish territories were divided again between the three partitioning powers. There was, under Russian rule in the first half of the 19th century, a so-called Crown Kingdom of Poland, where the Russian Tsar was actually the ruler, and it had a certain amount of autonomy. But if you look at the map from 1880 on the right, you see where it says Russian Empire, and right above it, it says Vistula land. In other words, the main river of that area. And in fact, the Russians were erasing the very name of Poland after the revolt of 1863, and they called the Polish territories under their rule Vistula land. As we said, there were Jews who were active in fighting for Poland, the most famous of which was Berek Yoselewicz, who organized a squadron of volunteers to fight in the Kosciuszko uprising in 1794. Kosciuszko, famous for helping the Americans in the American Revolution, returned to Poland and led another revolution of his own, which also was put down by the Russians. The most notable battle in which Joselewicz's unit fought was in the battle for Praga, which is the suburb on the other side of the Vistula River from Warsaw, in 1794. Here we have a picture rendered by Arthur Schick, where he says in the top in French, in honor of those who defended the Praga suburb of Warsaw by the regiment of Berek Jozelewicz, these people defended their country and fell in defense of their country. And this is, I make this picture in their memory. And on the right, there is the seal of Poland, the Republic of Poland, and an important slogan, Za wasza I nasza wolność, for your and our freedom. And this would be the watchword of Jewish revolutionaries, people who saw themselves as part of Poland, and they saw that their fight was both for Jewish freedom and for Polish freedom. Now, how did Orthodox Jews, like that young Simcha we saw whose unfortunate end was in the movie Schwadron, but how did Orthodox Jews regard this whole notion of reviving the Polish state and the wars around it from the time of Napoleon onward? Some of them, who I could call the Messianists, regarded these wars between nations as Milchemet Gog uMagog. This is a step toward the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people. Others, whom I call Pragmatists, were in a sense betting on the Polish horse, whether out of fear of retribution on the part of the revolutionaries, or hatred for the Russians, or a little bit of both. And we also find real patriots who identified with the Polish cause. And this could be both Orthodox Jews and secular Jews educated in Polish culture. The question which would be raised many times was this brotherhood a failed brotherhood? The Poles called their uprisings in the 19th century by the name of the month in which the uprising began. So the uprising of 1830, 1831 is called the November Uprising, and that of 1863 is called the January Uprising. And what we see here are Jews bearing arms. One of them in a fancy uniform, probably an officer of the Jewish Guard, others, some in classic Jewish dress, others in a mixture of kinds of dress. What's important to note, though, we talked about the problems of Jews in army service, and that is that for the most part, Jews were not allowed into combat units. They were more what we would call civil guard units and nothing more. Again, because they felt either the Jews did not have the experience or they still cannot totally be trusted. And here we have a so-called anthem of the Jewish National Guard of Warsaw from 1830. There are those who regard this as a humorous portrayal of Jews, and also even a feminization of Jews. Particularly, some people have pointed to the Jew in the middle with his knees together in a kind of so-called feminine pose, saying the Jews are not really soldiers. And we have a portrait done by a Frenchman who was visiting in Poland at the time, in color, of Jews in the municipal guard in 1831. And again, we see this is on the border between a serious portrayal and a little bit of satire and mocking, where the Jew is trying to get one of his fellow Jews to get in order, straighten up, stand up, and wear his badge. They're all wearing the badge that says local guard. And we have some contemporary reflections on what was happening at the time. A man by the name of Yaakov Halevi Levin wrote a diary of the years of the November insurrection in Hebrew. One copy was published, one version was published by Natan Michael Gelber many, many years ago, and he published it under the title Hayudim v'Hamered HaPolani, the Jews and the Polish Rebellion. There is a second version in manuscript which is very different, which one day I'll have to get to try to publish and show the difference between the two. And we have simple Jews who, in their memoirs, noted these days of the revolt. For example, Pinchas Schweitzer of Benjin, who says that in the days of the Polish revolt of 1831, I was 6. And the events that took place then in our city are ingrained in my memory. When I grew older, I also heard from my father all that occurred to us in those days. Once there arrived in town a paper, an order, to set up in town a security force and to include Jews in it. So here you see the notion, Jews are to be included. At that time there lived in Benjin 300 Jewish families. I remember that they gave the guardsmen iron lances, such as we saw in the pictures, and with these weapons they stood guard in the streets of the city. Among the guards were young and old, householders and paupers. It was an unforgettable sight. Pious Jews in long kaftans abandoned their commerce and their study houses and went around the city markets. On their heads they wore a cap which bore the legend security guard. Among the Jewish guards, who numbered around 30, one who particularly distinguished himself was Rav Anshel, a great Talmid Chacham. Rav Anshel used to say that he knew nothing about money, his knowledge of math was faulty, and he was an ignoramus in commerce. Nevertheless, he was compelled to abandon the Gemara and be a guard in the city's marketplaces. The Jews of Benjin still preserve the guards in their memory, and many families boast of their grandfathers who were Jewish soldiers. So this notion of a memory which was implanted among Jews and among Poles about Jews participating in the revolts. So here you see Jews in Warsaw in a fancier uniform, but also of note in the picture is that the Jews are bearded. This was one of the discussion points and debate points between those who were organizing these municipal guard units, whether the members could be bearded or had all be clean shaven. And here you see Jews, seemingly Orthodox Jews, in uniform with swords. These are the officers of the municipal guard in Warsaw. And again, the municipal guard was not a combat unit. But beyond these kind of memoirs, one of the images which was burned into the national memory of Poles and Jews was by the Polish national poet, national bard Adam Mickiewicz, who wrote his epic poem Pan Tadeusz in 1834 when he was in exile after fleeing from Poland to the west. And in Pan Tadeusz, which describes a meeting of all kinds of Poles discussing the future during the Napoleonic Wars in an estate in the eastern parts of Poland, one of the main characters and main conspirators is a Jew by the name of Yankel. And Yankel is not only a conspirator, but also an artist on the cymbal. And someone called a cymbalist has nothing to do with the cymbals we call it, but it's a stringed instrument, which we'll see in a moment in the picture. But here you see several, there are many, many versions of this picture of Yankel's concert, which he gives for the people gathered at this house. And again, here in the middle, people holding the cymbal for him. And finally, this version of Yankel's concert, again with two young Jewish boys holding it for him. And if you want to see what the cymbal looks like, this is what it looks like, and it's played with hammers. It's a stringed instrument that's played with hammers. But what's important for us is the image of Yankel. His ability as a musician is also part of the preservation of Polish national memory. And in the last book, book 12 of Pan Tadeusz, I went the wrong way, sorry. we have the description of Yankel, his playing, and his attitude towards Poland. Many symbolists were there, but when Yankel was present to play, none would dare. It's well known that not one on this instrument will equal him in sheer talent or taste or great skill. They entreat him to play, and the cembalo pass, the Jew much demur, saying his hands have grown crass, that he is out of practice, unworthy to play, with such lords present, bowing, try stealing away. Seeing this, Zosia runs up. She is a woman who is, her engagement is being celebrated at this gathering. In one white hand brings hammers, with which the master awakens the strings. With the other caresses the old man's great beard. With a curtsy she pleads, "Be so kind, Yankel dear. Please, this is my betrothal, so dear Yankel, play. You had promised too often for my wedding day." Yankel loves Zosia greatly. He nodded his head. As a sign he yields, so to the center is led. The cembalo is brought him, to sit he's invited. It is placed on his knees. He looks down much delighted. And proud too, as a veteran to service recalled. When the grandchildren drag his big sword off the wall, Grandad laughs, has not held it for many a day, but feels yet his hand will not the weapon betray. The blow struck with such skill, with such force unsurpassed, that the strings rang out boldly like trumpets of brass. Notice here the image that Mickiewicz gives for Yankel, that he gives an image as a soldier, but a soldier who fights with the hammers of his instrument. And this is what happens in the continuation. I skipped just a little bit. And from them to the heavens that song wafted, cherished, that triumphal march. Poland has never yet perished. March Dąbrowski to Poland. The audience entire clapped, and all March Dąbrowski cried out as a choir. And this song, March Dąbrowski, Poland has not died as long as we still live, became the Polish national anthem. Dąbrowski was the head of a legion, a Polish legion, fighting with Napoleon, going to the east, and he arrives just at the time of this gathering, and Yankel, in the middle of playing, after he has aroused people's memories, where each blow of the hammer recalled to people the events that led to the fall of Poland. And now he's playing, the musician, as if at his playing amazed, from his fingers both hammers let fall, his hands raised, from his brow to his shoulders his fox fur cap shifted, wafted gravely his beard to the heaven uplifted. To his cheeks reddish rings of unwanted blush came, his glance with spirit brimful, with youthful glowed flame. And when he, in Dąbrowski, his old eyes immersed, because the general shows up just at the right moment, soon them covered, though both hands a stream of tears burst, said he, "General, long Litva." Litva is Lithuania, but he's talking about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. "Awaited the news of your coming, as of the Messiah, we Jews. You 'twas among the people were long prophesied by the bards. You by signs were foretold from the skies. Live and fight, O our own." And his tears thickly fell. And look now, the good Jew, good Pole also, his homeland loved well. Dąbrowski his hand offered and thanked him for this. He, removing his cap, the great leader's hand kissed. So here you see Yankel as the ultimate Pole. First of all, he's a conspirator. In the earlier books in Pan Tadeusz, he takes part in the conspiratorial meetings and expresses his opinions, just like everybody else. His music preserves Polish historical memory, both the melody and the words, and the memory of the events which Poles had suffered in the past generation. And this literary image, now it may not have been known by the masses, but Yankel as an image does live on in Polish art, literature, music. But besides literary rebels, we had real rebels. For example, Rabbi Dov Berish Meisels, the chief rabbi of Warsaw, here in a photograph, in one of the rare photographs we have of some of these people. And Rabbi Meisels actually was a veteran conspirator and revolutionary because he also took part in the revolution in the 1830s, even serving in a revolutionary parliament for a while. And when he moved to Warsaw, again, he resumed his political activities in favor of Polish independence. And he's not the only rabbi or rebbe to be involved in Polish revolutionary politics. In the 1830s, who would become the first Gera Rebbe and the Kotzker Rebbe were both involved in revolutionary committees and had to flee Poland and made their way back to Poland only years later under assumed names. They had to change their name to come back to Poland. One of the major events that led up to the 1863 revolt was when Russian troops opened fire on a public demonstration in the streets of Warsaw and killed dozens of people. And the funeral of 5 of these victims became an act of demonstration of Polish solidarity. Here in this famous painting by the Jewish painter Alexander Lesser that was painted 10 or 15 years later, we see the funeral. None of these victims were Jewish, but yet we see all the clergy of Warsaw gathered, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. And we see Rabbi Meisels with his shtreimel. And right next to him, we see Rabbi Marcus Jastrow, who was the rabbi of the Reformed Liberal congregation in Warsaw. So we see Jewish solidarity, and some of the individuals here on the right have been identified by art historians, and several of them are Jewish businessmen who are also supporters of the Polish cause. I joke sometimes that today, I don't know what would get Rabbi Meisels in more trouble, his participation in a Catholic funeral or his co-participation with a Reform rabbi. But that's an issue for today's politics, religious politics, and not then. A second famous image of this period, of the demonstrations against Russian rule and the Russian atrocities against them, was the so-called story of the Jew with the cross. There was a Jew by the name of Michał Landy, who was a student of the modern rabbinical seminary that lasted for a few years in Warsaw. He eventually went to the regular gymnasium. And during the demonstration, when the Russian troops fired upon the crowd, a young priest who was holding the cross fell. And Landy, seeing this, picked up the cross as a Polish symbol and walked with the cross until he too was cut down by the Russian troops. And there's a plaque here which was put up not too many years ago commemorating the place where he fell and this act of Polish-Jewish solidarity. Here's another version of the death of Michał Landy, again being shot down by the Russian troops. Arthur Szyk, and this is part of his, again, Statute of Kalisz group of pictures, he maybe over-Jewified the Jew with the cross here, turning him into a Hasidic Jew with payas and everything. Landy was decidedly not that. But again, this image of the Jew with the cross, the Jew willing to take up the symbol of Poland, is something that persists in literature, in folklore, in other places. There was a lot of writing about and around the January insurrection of 1863, even more than that of 1830-31. A fine book which surveys this literature is the book by Magdalena Opalski and Yisrael Bartal called Poles and Jews, A Failed Brotherhood. The subtitle of the book gives the kind of pessimistic ending of it, but the book itself brings example after example of literary memoir and other examples of mentions of Polish-Jewish fraternization and amity. A Yiddish writer by the name of Aleph Almi wrote a book called 1863 Yiddische Powstanie Meiselach. That means Jewish uprising stories, which again brings many more stories and legends about what happened to Jews during the 1863 revolt. Now, besides the revolts, there are some other surprising signs and symbols of Polish-Jewish amity and symbiosis. One of them is the coat of arms of the town Kolbuszowa, which is in Galicia, which is something which I think is unique in Jewish history anywhere, where the coat of arms, other than in Israel, of course, but in the diaspora, where you see two hands shaking with the cross and the Star of David on the same coat of arms of the city. And if you go to the website of Kolbuszowa today, where I don't think a single Jew lives, indeed, this is still the symbol, the coat of arms of that city. Not all Jews, however, were sympathetic to the revolt. Yaakov Halevi Lifshitz, who wrote a book called Zichron Yaakov, which is one of the most important kind of memoirs of an Orthodox Jew in the 19th century. He's considered in many ways the father of Orthodox historiography. I won't read the whole selection here, but he talks about the fear when Poles started maneuvering in this forest near their towns, and they lived in the east where Poles were a minority of the population. When the Poles started maneuvering, getting ready for their revolt, we all were fearful that people would raid the towns, steal all of our goods, our food, and we were afraid. And he, in a sense, says that they were more loyal to the Russians than to the Poles. On the other hand, however, we have a Hasidic Rebbe with again, an unusual, unique viewpoint of an attitude toward Poland, Polish statehood, and Jews' attitude towards Poland. Here I translated into English the most significant part of his statement. It was well known that our rabbi of blessed memory did not love the Russian government. And even more so was he one of the people who promoted raising the crown of the Polish government. For every time he spoke in public, he would speak of these matters, showing his hatred for the Russian government for all to see. And by the way, this was not a simple thing to do because spies were everywhere, and the rabbi was arrested a few times and questioned by the police, by the Russians. And he would always pray that Poland would return to its government and kingdom, that Polish independence would return. And notice what he says now. Our rabbi had a saying that the coming of our righteous Messiah is dependent on Poland regaining its independence first, as a reward for taking in Jewish exiles and enabling a great Torah center to develop there. So this brings us back to our previous lecture, the story of Jews coming to Poland, Poland as a Torah center. But here you have a Hasidic Rebbe saying that the very Jewish redemption is dependent on Poland first receiving its independence. And another example we have from the days of the revolt of 1863, the memoirs of a rabbi's daughter, Cecilia Stuckold, of the town of Włocławek. During the days of the revolt of 1863, suddenly there began a whispering and murmuring as if by concert. Everyone began to speak in Polish. Poles and Jews had fraternization festivals and pledged mutual trust unto death. The people were terrified by night visitors who came for compulsory loans. So there still was the negative part, that people were holding up people for money or for goods, for food. Similar scenes took place during the earlier uprising of 1830-31. But again, what was the quote-unquote real attitude? We have literary portrayals, we have actions, but what did people think? And one good example is the example of Rabbi Meisels himself. There's a very interesting progression. There were a series of 3 or 4 biographies or obituaries written for Rabbi Meisels. And as we go from one to the next to the latest, we see that he becomes more and more patriotic and less pragmatic. It seems that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that he was a sincere Polish patriot, but he was also a pragmatist, seeing that this was the best move for Jews at the time, as far as he could understand the political constellation of the days. But what is the overall picture? Can we say that Jews are all patriots? Can we say that Jews are not? The overall picture is mixed, as every human picture is. the contemporary images existed of Jews as patriots, but also as spies for both sides, as Jews as smugglers, and Jews as disloyal. Glenn Diner, in his fine book entitled Yankel's Tavern, dug deep into the Polish archives, and he found in the archives examples of all types of behavior, with Jews far from the majority of the cases that came to court, or people being sent to prison or to Siberia. But the image of Polish-Jewish amity had its staying power for decades afterward. We talked about the importance of the insurrectionary tradition, but Poles at the time saw other avenues for cultivating Polish national identity. Some of them saw the insurrectionary tradition as really dangerous and counterproductive to any hope to restoring Polish independence. There was the program of so-called organic work and industry and commerce. In other words, to build up the infrastructure of Poland, to make it economically, industrially, and otherwise independent, being able to stand on its own. There was also the writing, teaching, and propagating of history. History was a weapon in keeping Polish national identity alive. The same is true as art and literature. The paintings of that we saw before of Matejko are just some examples of many where an art exhibition could be a major national event where people of all kinds would come to celebrate great events of Polish history as rendered by great Polish artists. And the same is true as music and theater, under the restraints, of course, of censorship. And involved in every one of these activities, we find Jewish notables and wider circles of Jews as well in all of these efforts. Another interesting phenomenon is the fact that even apostate Jews still maintained a certain amount of Jewish loyalty and helped Jewish causes and helped to further the Polish cause. And one final thing is that under Austrian rule in Galicia, from the 1870s onward, Polish autonomy existed, and the administration was placed in the hand of Poles, even though Poles were the minority. So that there isn't a chance for some kind of independent Polish or semi-independent Polish politics, even under Austrian rule. We talked about images, and one of the great Jewish artists of Poland was Maurycy Gottlieb. And we can see here in 3 of his pictures this whole notion of Jew as neighbor, stranger, and citizen. Because here we have his self-portrait. He looks very Jewish. But again, we have him in another self-portrait from a little earlier where he paints himself as a Polish nobleman. Wishful thinking, identification, a little bit of both. And finally, his self-portrait, whoops, sorry again. I went back 1 second. There. His self-portrait as Ahasuerus from 1876, wearing this strange kind of crown. And Ahasuerus is none other than the so-called wandering Jew. So here is the Jew as the ultimate stranger at home nowhere. So even in this artist of Maurycy Gottlieb, we see this being pulled in several directions regarding his own identity. But the Polishness of Polish Jews impressed people who came from the outside. A good example is the memoirs, someone named Memyud Freid, who wrote, he was a Jew from Lithuania who moved to Warsaw. And he was a Zionist organizer, and he was talking about his frustration in trying to organize Polish Jews to join the Zionist movement. And he said it is more difficult to organize the Polish Jews than those of other lands around the idea of settling the land of Israel. Why? They are too rooted in the life of the Polish nation, until it is hard to separate things that are stuck to one another. Even the Hasidim, who speak broken Polish, are complete Polish patriots and are loyal to their pact with this nation. with whom they have stood in sorrow and captivity, the captivity of Russia. The spirit of the common revolt still percolates in both of them, in the Jew and the Pole, and the period when they dreamed together a dream of redemption and rose up against the tyrant, and together hoped for better days that would come to all, is still remembered. So here we're talking about 40-some years later, after the revolt of 1863, and this outsider still sees this connection of Jews with Poland. We're reaching our conclusion. And next time when we talk about the interwar period, we'll see some of these developments toward the end of the 19th century, how they came to be to fruition in the interwar Poland when Poland regains its independence. For some, all of this experiment of Jews trying to be Polish citizens was a mistake, was an illusion. That Jews, in a sense, remained a state within a state, an unassimilable minority. And also Polish nationalism begins to change toward the end of the 19th century, when it becomes more and more exclusivist and more emphasizes the equation of Polishness with Catholicism, which of course leaves the Jews out. And another thing was the coming of the so-called Litvaks to Poland. They could move from the Pale of Settlement into Polish territory under Russian rule. This was allowed. And they built businesses and were important in industry. But they also brought with them Jewish nationalism, both the Bund and Zionism. And Polish nationalists saw this as something which disturbed the development of Polish nationalism, leading the Jews away from their Polish loyalties. So is this a kind of unrequited love of Jews and Poles? That we'll have to see next time. In the same way, could Jews be acculturated without totally being integrated? And this would be our big question in the interwar period. I want to finish with just 4 lines from a poem from the Polish Jewish poet Maurycy Schimmel, who wrote in Polish and Yiddish, but this was in Polish, where he talks about who he is and how he looks at Poland and Poles. He says, "Gray peasant horse," which symbolizes Poland, "how does my love appear to you when I caress your warm, sweaty head with a shivering hand, the shy hand of a Jew?" I think we'll finish here for tonight. Looking forward to next time and talking about the interwar period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gershon. We have a few questions, and we'll see how many we can get you to answer. You can take a zip, and I'll choose a question for you.
Thank you.
Why did Schick find it necessary to portray a Jewish patriot as a Hasidic Jew in the picture you showed earlier?
I ask myself that question very often. I think he wanted to make the contrast even greater. If it's a Jew in so-called civilian dress where he doesn't look very Jewish, holding up a cross, you could say, well, you don't know who it is. But if it's a Jew with payas, then you say, oh, this is a real Jew with a cross. So I think he did it to emphasize the contrast of the Jew with the cross, even though it was not necessary.
So there's no room for mistakes. Would you say that the Jewish involvement and identity in pro-national affairs in Poland was greater in the 19th century in Poland? Was it greater in Poland than in other countries in Europe?
I wouldn't say that. I think that Jews in France were great French patriots, despite, the Dreyfus affair, and Jews in Germany were great German patriots, etc., etc. But still, this Polish-Jewish relationship has something special about it. I recall again that coat of arms of Kolbuszova with the 2 hands shaking. It's something you don't see anything like that in France or Germany or any other place. And the image of Yankel, I don't think you find in other countries a Jew being the ultimate symbol of national memory and national resistance as Yankel is in Pan Tadeusz, which is the Polish national epic that Polish students to this day have to memorize large parts of it. So that's something which is really unique to Poland.
Okay, here's a long question. Let's see. David wants to know. He mentions Adam Mickiewicz from
Mickiewicz,
Lvov, Mickiewicz, and he says that his monument is still standing, and other monuments were removed by Germans, Russians, and Ukrainians. And is this because he was a champion of the working class?
Not necessarily, but he was a symbol of Poland. So in Krakow, in the square in front of the Sukienica, the cloth hall, there's Mickiewicz's statue. His statues were torn down by lots of places, by Germans, by Russians, because he was regarded as the ultimate symbol of Polish patriotism. So it's not strange that people would want to get rid of his statues from other countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we'll take a last question here. One of our listeners mentioned that his mother's parents are from Bryzny, a city with about half Jewish and half Polish. And the Jews there never expressed any Polish sympathies, but they did sympathize with Franz Josef. And why might this be the case?
Well, it depend on when, because we find for most of the 19th century, Jewish intellectuals, Jews who looked to general culture, looked to German culture. But towards the end of the 19th century, when the Poles took over the administration, we see a switch to more of a Polish orientation. But that doesn't mean that the pro-Austrian orientation disappeared entirely. And the respect and love that Jews had for the Emperor Franz Josef is something which is known all through the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it's not strange that Jews would hold that kind of affection for the emperor. But yet, again, toward the end of the 19th century, we see signs of Jews moving more and more towards Polish nationalism, Polish language, and Polish culture, rather than German language and German culture.
Okay, thank you very much, Gershon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to our staff who are helping us run this session. And we hope you join us next week as we move on to our third session in the series.
Thank you very much. Good night to all from Jerusalem.